The day had stretched into a tense blur for Martin as he stood outside the courthouse, the harsh afternoon light casting long shadows over the stone steps. Every inch of his body was taut with anticipation, every breath heavy with the memory of Paul's laughter, now forever silenced by Richard's actions. Paul had been more than just a brother, he was Martin's best friend, a man whose joy was contagious and whose absence now felt like an open wound. Martin's fingers brushed against the cool metal of the gun tucked securely beneath his jacket. The weight of it grounded him, but he didn't pull it out. Not yet. The bustling murmurs of the crowd, the chatter of reporters, and the shouts of police officers setting up a barrier were a backdrop to the storm brewing inside him. This wasn't the right moment, too many eyes, too many potential complications. No, he needed the perfect opportunity, one where he could look Richard in the eyes before pulling the trigger. As the hours ticked by, Martin's resolve only grew sharper. The courtroom doors stood ominously closed, the trial dragging on longer than expected. Each time the doors opened, revealing the faint echo of raised voices and hurried whispers, Martin's heart jumped, expecting to see Richard's smug face. But it was only lawyers, clerks, and the occasional official moving in and out. "Hold steady," Martin whispered to himself, the memory of Paul's funeral flashing before his eyes, the somber faces, the rain pattering on the closed casket, and the promise he had made under his breath as he clenched a fistful of damp earth. "I will make him pay, Paul. I swear it." With a sigh, he glanced at his watch. The courthouse clock chimed 4 times, each note ringing like a countdown. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, loosening his shoulders but keeping his senses sharp. From his vantage point, he could see the main exit clearly, the line of parked cars, and the crowd of reporters waiting hungrily for news. The sky had begun to dim, the blue deepening as the golden light receded, casting a more dramatic stage for what was to come. The gun felt heavier now, as if it understood its role in the act Martin was about to commit. He brushed a hand across the fabric of his jacket, feeling the outline beneath it. Soon, he thought. But not yet. The courthouse doors burst open, releasing a wave of noise that swept through the waiting crowd. Camera flashes ignited like bursts of lightning, illuminating the press that surged forward in a chaotic frenzy. Voices overlapped in a discordant chorus of questions. "Mr. Richard, any comments on today's verdict?" "Do you feel justice has been served?" "What do you plan to do next?" Richard appeared at the center of this storm, his sharp suit immaculate, his expression one of controlled composure. The air around him pulsed with a kind of practiced arrogance, the same look that had fueled Martin's rage ever since the trial began. Even as Richard answered questions with a cool, almost detached smile, Martin saw through the facade, the flicker of something deeper, something unrepentant in those cold eyes. With his heart thundering in his chest, Martin stepped forward, weaving through the press with silent determination. He kept his head low, avoiding eye contact, his focus locked on Richard's every movement. His pulse raced, a drumbeat echoing in his ears, growing louder as the distance between them shrank. Richard's voice cut through the noise as he answered a question, laughter following in its wake. He looked invincible, untouchable. But Martin knew better. He had watched Richard tear Paul's life apart without remorse, and now, with only a few steps left, Martin's fingers twitched toward the gun hidden beneath his jacket. Suddenly, Richard's attention shifted. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his cell phone, raising a hand to silence the reporters. The crowd fell back a little, giving him just enough space as he began speaking into the phone. The noise dropped to a low hum, the reporters waiting impatiently for the conversation to end. Martin's jaw clenched. This was it, the moment. Richard was distracted, his face turned slightly away, the arrogant tilt of his chin inviting what Martin had planned for so long. He stepped closer, close enough now to hear the low, confident tone of Richard's voice as he spoke. "Yes, Donovan, I know. Everything is under control. Just make sure it stays that way, Richard said, a smirk curling the edge of his mouth. Martin's breath caught in his throat. The rage, long simmering, erupted. His hand closed around the gun's grip, the cool metal sending a shiver up his arm. He felt his heart pound like a war drum, each beat chanting justice, justice, justice. He moved in, eyes narrowing as he raised the gun. The sharp crack of a gunshot tore through the chaotic scene outside the courthouse, slicing through the cacophony of reporters' questions and the rustle of shuffling bodies. Martin flinched, his outstretched arm faltering as the crowd erupted into a frenzy of shouts and gasps. Time seemed to stutter, the noise morphing into a low roar as panic took hold. Cameras flashed in confusion, and people scattered like leaves in a sudden windstorm. Gunshot. Someone's shooting, a voice screamed, followed by others joining in a chorus of panic. Martin's eyes, wide with shock, darted from Richard's startled expression to the source of the chaos. His breath hitched as he realized Richard hadn't been hit, he was still standing, though the smirk had drained from his face, replaced by a pale mask of confusion and alarm. But it wasn't Martin who had fired. A metallic tang of realization flooded his senses. Someone else had the same idea, and they'd acted on it. Above, hidden among the jagged skyline of nearby rooftops, Mark lay prone on a concrete ledge, his sniper rifle angled toward the bustling street below. The sun reflected off the lens of his scope as he watched the scene through it, steady as a hawk. He exhaled slowly, eyes narrowing as he assessed the moment. His initial shot had missed its mark, an uncharacteristic error for someone of his caliber, but the shifting crowd and the sudden press scrum had thrown off his perfect angle. Mark clenched his jaw, ears ringing slightly as he felt the weight of the mission pressing down on him. Donovan's words from the night before echoed in his mind, cold and demanding, Richard doesn't leave that courthouse breathing. Make sure of it, Mark. This is our only chance. Sweat trickled down Mark's temple, a slow bead that caught on the edge of his brow before slipping away unnoticed. He adjusted his aim, repositioning to compensate for the rapid movement below. Through the crosshairs, he saw Richard, eyes darting wildly as he registered the attempted assassination. The target was aware now, bodyguards scrambling into action and forming a protective barrier around him. Stay down, sir, one of the bodyguards shouted, shoving Richard toward the waiting car. Martin, momentarily stunned by the unexpected shot, clenched his fists. He looked around frantically, struggling to comprehend what had just happened. This wasn't part of his plan. The tight knot of anger and adrenaline in his chest turned to confusion and frustration. Who else wanted Richard dead, and why? Up above, Mark sucked in a sharp breath, zeroing in on Richard again as the bodyguards formed a shield. The angle was compromised, but he couldn't wait any longer. The mission had to succeed, failure wasn't an option. He whispered to himself, voice steady as he made the final adjustment. Goodbye, Richard. But before Mark could pull the trigger, another voice cut through the chaos, urgent and commanding. Shots fired. Locate the source now, Edward, the police officer attending the trial, shouted as he pushed through the throng of reporters and civilians. His eyes swept upward, searching for a glint of metal, a flash of movement. The tension rippled outward, fear mixing with anger as the officers took defensive positions. From the corner of his eye, Mark saw uniformed figures spilling out into the open, their weapons raised and their eyes scanning for him. He gritted his teeth. Too late, he thought. But as he prepared for his final shot, a sharp sound pierced the air, the crack of a bullet, not from his rifle, but from a handgun below. Martin's finger, trembling and unsure, had pulled the trigger in a moment of blind impulse. Mark's breathing was steady, practiced, each inhale and exhale a metronome guiding his sharp focus. From his perch on the rooftop, he had a perfect view of the scene below, the courthouse steps crawling with journalists wielding microphones like weapons, their voices blending into an indistinct roar. Their presence had been an unforeseen complication, their movement jostling Richard and obscuring the clean shot Mark needed. He muttered to himself, lips barely moving. "Come on, move, give me an opening." Richard stood at the heart of the chaotic throng, his head turning slightly as a question from a reporter caught his attention. The crowd's noise surged and swirled around him, a storm of demands and accusations that he brushed off with a practiced smile and a dismissive wave. To the public, he was untouchable. To Mark, he was a target at the edge of his crosshairs, elusive but within reach. Mark's finger hovered over the trigger, muscles tensed, his senses honed in on the rhythm of the moment. Every second ticked by slowly, each one precious and taunting. The sun reflected off Richard's dark hair, the only steady glint in a scene full of movement. Then, like water parting around a stone, the press began to break apart as Richard shifted, turning away from their questions. He reached into his pocket, fishing out his phone, the screen's faint glow catching the light as he answered a call. His voice, deep and authoritative, was faint but discernible, carried up to Mark in pieces by the wind. "Donovan, I'm outside now. Yes, I did exactly as we discussed," Richard said, his tone tense, urgency straining through his polished exterior. He glanced at the car waiting at the curb, a sleek, black sedan that promised safety. Mark adjusted his scope, heart thumping a slow, steady beat as he watched Richard's profile shift into clear view. This was the moment. The crowd was thinning, reporters moving back and focusing their lenses elsewhere, the guards forming looser perimeters as their primary concern walked away from the immediate chaos. "Perfect," Mark whispered, aligning the sights until they settled squarely over Richard's chest. He took in a final breath, letting it expand through him, centering every cell in his body. His hand tightened. He was ready. Below, Richard continued his conversation, oblivious to the cold stare of Mark's gaze that held his life in its sights. "No, Donovan. I won't wait," Richard snapped, a flash of frustration breaking through his calm. "Tell him it ends today, one way or another." Mark smirked, sensing the irony in Richard's words. If only he knew. His finger pressed against the trigger, a feather's weight away from ending it all. The noise, the sun, the wind, they all fell away. In this second, the world narrowed to just him and the man below, connected by the thin line of his crosshairs. And then, as if fate itself had leaned in to watch, Richard shifted to the side, half turning as someone called out to him from the sedan. The moment slipped by like sand through fingers, the shot evaporating as Richard stepped behind a guard who had raised an arm to open the car door. Mark exhaled, the air escaping him like a hiss of steam. He waited, patience laced with irritation. A shot taken in haste was a shot wasted, and there would be no room for mistakes. This was his only chance. "Come on, Richard," Mark muttered, readjusting his aim, his eye never leaving the moving figure. Below, Richard, phone still pressed to his ear, nodded to someone unseen inside the car. He shifted again, now in profile, and Mark saw the clear path he needed. Richard glanced over his shoulder one last time as he wrapped up his call, a ghost of a smirk dancing at the edge of his mouth. "Time's up," Mark said, pulling the trigger. But before the crack of his rifle pierced the air, a gunshot echoed from below, jarring and unexpected. The scene erupted into chaos once more. The gunshot rang out like a sudden peal of thunder, ricocheting off the courthouse walls and slicing through the cacophony of voices. Mark's finger froze mid-pull as confusion flooded his senses. His pulse thumped heavily in his ears, and for a split second, he scanned the scene below, searching for the origin of the sound. He had not fired. The bullet had not come from his rifle. From his perch, he could see the eruption of chaos spreading through the crowd. Reporters screamed and ducked, microphones clattering to the ground as people scattered like startled birds. Security officers yelled, their hands instinctively going to their belts as they formed a protective wall around Richard, who had fallen back against the sedan, eyes wide with shock. "Damn it," Mark hissed, leaning away from the rifle's scope and scanning for movement. Meanwhile, in the crowd below, Edward stood to the side of the courthouse steps, his dark eyes focused and alert beneath the brim of his police cap. His radio crackled at his hip, buzzing with fragmented reports of disorder and confusion. But he was not listening. His gaze was fixed on Richard, who was now pinned against the sedan, his phone dropped and forgotten at his feet. Edward's jaw tensed as he pressed the phone to his ear, Donovan's voice still on the line. "Donovan," Edward said, voice taut with urgency. "Did you send Mark?" "Did you?" The response came through, sharp and unyielding. "Yes, Edward, I did. But you're too late to interfere. By the time you piece this together, Richard will be." A pause followed, one heavy with the weight of realization, as Donovan heard the pandemonium through the line. Edward could picture him now, far from the scene, eyes narrowing in confusion as he pieced together what had just transpired. What the hell just happened? Donovan barked, voice dropping to a dangerous growl. Edward's eyes swept over the scene, Mark's missed opportunity, the flash of metal in the hands of an unknown figure now lost in the chaos, and Richard, alive but reeling. The pieces of the puzzle shifted rapidly in Edward's mind, and he cursed under his breath. "Something you didn't plan for," Edward snapped. He dropped the phone into his pocket, gaze darting back to Richard, who was now scrambling back into the car, shielded by panicked security. He took a step forward, heart pounding with the weight of his next move. This was no longer a simple case of tracking down a killer or protecting witnesses. The tangled web of deception, crossed loyalties, and shifting allegiances had finally frayed to its breaking point. Edward's thoughts raced as he put his hand on the radio at his belt. "Control, this is Officer Edward Miller. Shots fired outside the courthouse. I need all available units. Suspect may still be armed and on site." Above, Mark watched the chaos unfold with clenched teeth. The shot had been fired, but not by him. His mind whirred with the realization, someone else had taken a shot at Richard. But who? And why had the timing overlapped so precisely with his own? This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He ducked lower, lifting his rifle to scan the crowd through his scope. Adrenaline coursed through him, sharp and unforgiving. His carefully laid plan was disintegrating before his eyes, and with every second that passed, the window to act grew narrower. Below, Edward moved through the chaos, eyes narrowing as he took in every face, every telltale sign of guilt or innocence. The threads of the plot, tangled and frayed, now lay open before him. The players were revealed, but the game had just turned deadly, and unpredictable. Donovan sat in his dimly lit office, a wide mahogany desk separating him from the small crowd of trusted men standing in tense silence. His sharp suit hung off his broad shoulders as he paced, the faint ticking of an antique clock filling the room with a relentless beat. The call he'd just ended with Richard echoed in his mind, each word replaying with a nauseating clarity. "You did what?" Donovan had whispered, barely keeping his composure. Richard's smooth voice had cut through the line, confident, almost mocking. "I told Edward everything," Richard had said. "He knows about Mark, knows who he really works for." "So, what now, Donovan? Still think I'm just another pawn in your game?" Donovan's jaw had clenched as the weight of Richard's betrayal sank in. The line had gone dead before he could respond, leaving only the pounding in his chest and the realization that he'd underestimated Richard. Now, standing in his office, Donovan's mind raced. He spun on his heel and slammed a fist down on the desk, making the men before him jump. Their eyes flickered with a mix of fear and anticipation. Finally, Donovan's icy gaze settled on one of them, Miguel, a lean, sharp-eyed enforcer known for getting things done without questions. "Miguel," Donovan barked, his voice low and rough, "I need this mess handled. Now." He opened a drawer and pulled out a gleaming .45 Magnum pistol, its metallic sheen catching the dim light. He placed it on the desk with a thud and pushed it toward Miguel. Miguel's eyes met Donovan's, his expression unreadable, but a slight nod confirmed he understood. He stepped forward, grabbed the pistol, and tucked it into the back of his waistband without a word. You find Richard, Donovan continued, leaning forward, his face mere inches from Miguel's, and you make sure he knows the price of betrayal. Whatever it takes, do you understand? Miguel nodded again, sharper this time. Understood, boss. The room shifted, the men exchanging glances as Miguel left, the door clicking shut behind him. Donovan exhaled, his mind moving a mile a minute. He couldn't afford to lose control now, too much was at stake. With Mark already in play, the game had been set, but Richard's audacity to warn Edward shifted the balance. Earlier, in the sterile confines of a back office at the courthouse, Richard had met with Edward. The room was small, with cream-colored walls and an old, humming air conditioner. Richard's dark hair was neatly combed, but his tie was loose, his shirt creased as if he'd been gripping it too tightly in frustration. Edward sat across from him, leaning back in a chair with arms crossed, listening intently. Donovan won't stop, Richard said, his voice strained but clear. He's not just looking to take control of the city's underworld. He wants to own it, piece by piece. And Mark? Edward's brow furrowed. Mark? The sniper? What about him? Richard leaned forward, eyes darting to the locked door as if he expected it to burst open any moment. He's not just a gun for hire. He's Donovan's inside man. A spy planted to keep tabs on every job, every associate. Edward's eyes narrowed, the puzzle pieces falling into place. And why are you telling me this now, Richard? Why play the savior? Richard's mouth twitched in a half-smile, a mixture of regret and defiance. Because I'm tired of being Donovan's pawn. If this ends today, I want my name cleared. But if it doesn't, his gaze hardened. Then at least you'll know who's really pulling the strings. Edward stood, pacing the length of the room, processing the gravity of Richard's words. He stopped abruptly, turning to face Richard. This information is explosive. But if you're playing both sides, I need more than just words. I need proof. Richard's phone buzzed on the table, the vibration breaking the heavy silence. He glanced at the name flashing on the screen and sighed. That proof might come sooner than you think. Edward stared at him, and for a moment, they were on the same side, two men staring down the same barrel of an impending storm. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm, orange glow over the courthouse steps as Richard stepped out. The tension in his body was evident, every step he took felt heavier than the last, as though the very air around him was pressing down with invisible force. The echoes of the crowd had faded, leaving a fragile silence that hummed with latent energy. His fingers itched, but he forced himself to stay calm as he pulled out his phone and dialed Donovan's number. The line clicked, and Donovan's deep, gravelly voice answered after a single ring. "Richard," he said, his tone sharp and guarded, like a coiled snake ready to strike. Richard didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Listen, we have a problem. A big one." There was a pause, a silence so thick Richard could almost hear Donovan's mind working, calculating. "I'm aware," Donovan finally replied, his voice low. "Word travels fast. You thought telling Edward everything would protect you?" Richard's jaw clenched. He could hear the fury, the tightly controlled rage, and he knew this conversation was a dance on the edge of a blade. "I had no choice, Donovan." He was getting too close, and it was either cooperate or go down with the ship. "But there's still a way out of this for both of us." Donovan let out a bitter chuckle. "A way out? You've just painted a target on your back, and mine as well. What kind of game are you playing, Richard?" Richard turned and leaned against his car, eyes scanning the street for any sign of a tail. He spoke carefully, each word sharpened with intent. "Mark. He's the link. He's been playing double agent for too long, reporting everything back to you while staying close to Edward's operations. If we cut him loose, take him out of the equation, then we can control what Edward knows." The silence that followed was cold, stretching longer than Richard liked. Finally, Donovan exhaled audibly, a sound between frustration and thoughtfulness. "And why should I believe you'd help me after selling me out to the police?" Richard's lips curved into a strained smile. "Because as long as Edward is breathing down my neck, I'm no good to you or myself. Take out Mark, and I'll lead Edward into thinking he's chasing shadows. That buys you time, and it buys me my life." There was a murmur in the background on Donovan's end, a rustle of papers, the shuffling of feet as someone entered the room. Donovan's voice, now sharper, came back. "Do you really think Mark won't see this coming?" Richard ran a hand through his dark hair, sweat beading on his brow. "He's too focused on the job, on taking me out like you ordered. He won't see it coming if you make the move first." Donovan's pause this time was brief. "If I do this, Richard, you better pray it's worth it. You betray me again, and there won't be a place on this earth you can hide." A shiver coursed down Richard's spine. The threat was real, as tangible as the gun in his pocket. But he nodded, even though Donovan couldn't see it. "Trust me, Donovan, I'm betting my life on it." The call ended with a decisive click, the weight of their conversation still hanging in the air like smoke. Richard pocketed his phone and stared out at the city, the lights flickering on as night fell. The gamble had been set, and now, all that remained was to see who would fall first in the deadly game of loyalty and betrayal. The sharp crack of a gunshot shattered the evening's uneasy quiet. For a split second, time seemed to stop as the sound ricocheted off the stone facades of the nearby buildings. Every head on the street turned, faces frozen in shock as birds erupted from their roosts, fleeing the sudden violence. Richard flinched, instinctively ducking as he looked around, searching for the source. Edward stood in the shadows at the edge of the courthouse, eyes focused, posture unyielding, and gun arm extended. The scent of gunpowder mingled with the crisp, cool air. His jaw was clenched tight, eyes locked onto the rooftop of the building across the street. Richard's heart raced as he spun around, chest heaving. He expected pain, the warmth of blood seeping through his clothes, the final exclamation of betrayal. But none came. Instead, he looked up and followed Edward's line of sight. Across the way, the silhouette of a man crumpled, the shadowy figure collapsing onto the rooftop's gravelly surface with an almost eerie grace. Mark's rifle clattered next to him, sliding until it teetered at the edge and then fell silently to the ground below. The crowd's murmurs swelled into an uproar, reporters fumbling to catch their breath and journalists shouting into their microphones. Sirens wailed in the distance, approaching with urgent speed. Richard stood rooted to the spot, the world blurring around him as the realization hit him: he was alive. Edward's shot had saved him. Edward's gaze met Richard's across the chaos, and there was an unspoken understanding in that brief, electric moment. The officer nodded once, almost imperceptibly, before slipping the gun back into his holster and stepping out into the light, his police badge gleaming under the street lamps. Richard swallowed hard, forcing his legs to move as Edward approached. The policeman's expression was unreadable, but his eyes held a glimmer of grim satisfaction. "I told you to keep your head down, didn't I?" Edward said, his voice rough, yet calm against the cacophony of shouts and blaring sirens. Richard managed a nod, his voice caught somewhere between disbelief and gratitude. "I didn't think you'd actually watch my back." Edward's gaze sharpened, scanning the crowd to ensure no other threats lingered. "It's not about trust, Richard. It's about justice. And now, maybe, we can finally put an end to this mess." Moments later, uniformed officers stormed the building across the street, scaling staircases and bursting onto the rooftop. Richard and Edward watched as the police emerged, shaking their heads and speaking into their radios. The body of Mark, the feared and elusive sniper, lay sprawled, lifeless beneath the dim glow of rooftop floodlights. The rifle that had nearly sealed Richard's fate was nothing but cold, inert metal at his side. "Looks like your gamble paid off," Edward said, his voice softening just a touch as he glanced at Richard. The tension between them, forged by necessity and thinly veiled distrust, seemed to dissipate with the wind that swept through the street. Richard took a deep breath, the reality of the moment washing over him. For now, he replied, eyes flicking to the rooftop where Mark's figure was still visible. But Donovan won't forget this. Edward's lips tightened into a thin line. Let him come. This city's seen enough blood. Maybe it's time we finish what your brother started. Richard's expression darkened as the memory of Paul's face flashed in his mind, a reminder of why he had fought so hard to survive. He turned back to Edward, the officer who had risked everything to take a shot not just at a man, but at a network of deceit and violence that had gripped them all. Then we fight, Richard said, his voice steady, conviction hardening in his chest. But this time, we ended on our terms. The two men stood side by side as the last echo of sirens faded, the city holding its breath for what would come next.